Hola y bienvenidos a todos. Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts podcast. My name is Devin, and this episode is part 2 in the Latin American history series. We will continue the story of Latin America in 1492 with some background on medieval and early modern Europe, the arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese and the colonization of the New World, the expansion of the conquistadors in the 1500s, the development of new cultures and castes within Latin America in the 1600s and 1700s, and the wars of independence that finally ended colonial rule in the early 1800s. Vámonos! So for some background, what was going on in Europe before the arrival of Europeans in the Caribbean, and what led to the Spanish arriving in the New World in the first place? The story of the Latin side of Latin America really begins with the Reconquista all the way back in the 8th century and started with the conquest of Iberia by the Umayyad Caliphate in the year 711 under the Arab and indigenous North African Berber forces of Tariq ibn Ziyad, known as the Moors, and this sparked centuries and centuries of conflict between Christian kingdoms and Muslim states in Iberia, with the Christian forces hiding out in the mountainous region of Asturias in the north and reinforcements entering through the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. The Muslim-controlled regions of Portugal and Spain became known as Al-Andalus and were surprisingly more advanced than other regions of Europe at the same time, not counting the Byzantine Eastern Romans. And this is because they were part of a more interconnected system that linked it to the rest of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world, along with it being much more open and having much more people of many backgrounds, Christians, Muslims, and Jews included, with more tolerance for all, even if it was still a system where the conquerors or the Muslim rulers ultimately made the rules, and some of them could be very repressive as time went on. The Umayyad Caliphate, however, was overthrown in its own home territory of Arabia and Mesopotamia, which led to another caliphate known as the Abbasids taking over, and from here, Al-Andalus would split off and become its own country in 756 under Abd ar-Rahman in the independent Emirate of Cordoba, which would later become the Caliphate of Cordoba in 929. The peak of Al-Andalus was around the 900s to the early 1000s under the Caliphate of Cordoba, and from there, things started going downhill as the authority of the Caliph broke down, and local rulers called taifas took control instead. In 1086, a Berber or indigenous North African dynasty called the Almoravids, which includes Saharan tribes, expanded into Al-Andalus, and they disapproved of the local Muslim taifas for being too lenient. They weren't strict enough, and they enforced a much harsher form of Maliki Islam instead. But in turn, the Almoravids would also be overthrown by the Almohads, who are another Berber North African dynasty, and they took over in 1147, and they began to alienate the aforementioned Christian and Jewish population, and they often attacked other Muslims for not being pious or strict enough. They also enforced a much more radical type of Islam under a Unitarian doctrine that elevated the leader Ibn Tumart to being the chosen one, or Mahdi, before he too was ousted in the early 1200s. By the mid-1200s, the Christians had taken over most of Iberia, but there were still some strong Muslim states in the south. Though in the 1400s, the Portuguese got their own independence from the Muslims in 1415, and they started sailing around the coast of West Africa, where they pioneered the first proto-slave plantations, and eventually crossed around the bottom part of Africa into the Indian Ocean, where they could participate more directly in the spice trade, which was focused around India and Southeast Asia. In 1453, Constantinople, which was the final bastion of the Eastern Roman Empire, was captured by the Ottoman Empire, and they brought in some of the largest cannons in history at the time. They blasted the titanic walls of the city, which had stood for many centuries, until it was broken, and the Turks entered and pillaged the city for 3 days. After this, Byzantine survivors fled and brought with them knowledge and expertise in science, art, philosophy, and the military to the West, which was already going through the Renaissance, and this accelerated the process even further, making Western Europe increasingly on par with the Islamic world or China, which had been, for much of medieval history, more advanced. And by the 1490s, the Muslims only had a small foothold in Granada, which is at the very southernmost edge of Iberia. And then in 1492, they were defeated, and Spain, united between the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, was now independent, militarily powerful, full of expansionist crusading energy, and ironically, due to Muslim rule, more advanced than most of its European neighbors, and also one of the foremost military powers of its time. This advancement also included sailing technology, derived from the Arab lateen-styled ships called Caribs, which enabled the Portuguese and later Spanish to sail across the Atlantic, and new ships called caravels. By this point, the Ottomans had also begun blocking trade between the Far East and India with the West, and when they did allow trade through, they began demanding very steep tariffs that made the European Christian nations reluctant to trade with them, and they began seeking new routes to the east to bypass the Ottomans, and that includes Portuguese routes of sailing all around Africa into the Indian Ocean. But there are also a few new theories that you could sail to China directly by going west. This leads to the next question. Who were the first Iberians to reach the Americas, and what did they do when they found the New World? The first Iberians to reach America were actually led by a non-Iberian, an Italian man, or man from the Republic of Genoa named Cristoforo Colombo, better known in English as Christopher Columbus. The Spanish crown was originally reluctant to send Columbus out on his proposed expedition to find a western route to China and India because contemporary experts in Europe at the time argued that this was impossible, and it wasn't because they thought the Earth was flat and that Columbus would sail off the edge. It was because they disagreed with Columbus on how large the Earth was, and they believed correctly that Columbus wouldn't be able to sail directly from Europe to the Far East with the technology they had at the time. However, Columbus was very persistent, and he went around Europe asking different monarchs, including the Portuguese king John II and the English king Henry VII and the French king Charles VIII, to fund the expedition until finally the Spanish king Ferdinand II said yes after completing the reconquest of Iberia. Now, Columbus is a very controversial character because he began waves of colonization and immigration from Europe to the Americas that created pretty much every country that we know today. That includes the United States and Latin America and every single Latin American country. But he also wiped out most of the people he came into contact with and committed major atrocities against the indigenous Taino people. The unfortunate truth is that he's both of those things at the same time. He led one of the greatest changes in human history in the Columbian Exchange, which connected the old world of Africa, Europe, and Asia to the Americas and Caribbean, which benefited millions of people at the costs of millions of people. A further complication, which I often don't think gets brought up, is that even by the standards of his time, Columbus was engaged in activities that were widely condemned by his fellow Europeans because he was a corrupt and often arbitrary and petty governor of the islands he discovered. He mutilated and executed colonists without warning, and he mismanaged the colony because he would often confiscate supplies or goods that were sent in, and he wouldn't compensate the people who had sent it or who were supposed to receive them, to the point that there were actually mutinies against Columbus by fellow Spaniards, and he ended up being jailed by the Spanish crown themselves for repeatedly trying to take their money and embezzle from them. And on a more controversial note, Columbus was a prolific rapist. He repeatedly abused prepubescent indigenous girls, and while the standards of Europe in the 1490s are not even close to what kinds of standards we have today, it was still considered pretty excessive and not very justifiable for him to be doing that. So even by the standards of the time, and even if Columbus is not really responsible for many future atrocities or oppressive systems committed by people who were around centuries after his death and weren't even Spanish and often didn't even approve of what the Spanish did, he was still a very ruthless and dangerous man, much more like a Blackwater private military company captain, or even Tariq ibn Ziyad and the Arab conquerors who had taken over Spain in the first place, much more close to them than a modern entrepreneur explorer like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. Columbus's efforts and that of his men and supervisors eventually founded settlements in Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, which today is the island that makes up both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The reason behind why they were able to do this so effectively was the massive technological gap between indigenous Americans and Iberians. While the indigenous Caribbeans were still effectively living in a Stone Age level of development, they mostly used bows and arrows, they mostly used stone tools. They didn't have any real kind of metal. They didn't have like iron armor or any of that. The Spanish had swords, early muskets called arquebuses, they had cannons, metal plate armor, they had caravels, horses, and they had the training to use all of these types of weapons and technology very effectively. But more than just technology was the sheer gap in disease immunity, because virtually every part of Eurasia and Africa, also known as the Old World, have long-term exposure to animals that led to millions of people dying from plagues and other animal-to-human diseases, which simply didn't exist outside of the Old World. This was effectively biologically unknown across the New World, so the indigenous people didn't have much of an immunity to these diseases. At the same time, Portugal was exploring the seas because they had actually begun doing so well before the Spanish had, but their activities were mostly focused on the Old World, around Africa and India, going into Southeast Asia. And in 1494, they made an agreement with the Spanish and created the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a vertical line going through the Atlantic Ocean, where everything to the east in the Old World would go to Portugal, and everything in the west in the New World would go to Spain. Now, they didn't entirely draw it through the Atlantic because, as it turns out, parts of the line that they drew actually cut through the eastern half of Latin America and includes what's now today known as Brazil, from the Brazil wood trees that grow there. The man to discover Brazil, at least on paper, was Pedro Cabral, and he sailed to and founded Brazil in 1500 after a expedition that was supposed to go to India ended up going off course, and they discovered, quote unquote, discovered Brazil by accident. But it's been speculated that this was a mere formality and that they already knew Brazil was there. And the reason why they had drawn the line going through the Atlantic in that specific area was to make sure they had some foothold in the New World. And that the expedition that was reported to have gone off course was supposed to be the best funded at the time and also crewed by the best experts at the time. So the fact they went that far off course and just happened to discover a new country just seems kind of strange. It's never been confirmed, but that does seem to be the consensus, that he wasn't actually the one to discover Brazil. He just was the guy who took the credit for it officially. And now we're in the age of the conquistadors. So how is it that an entire continent was taken over by a handful of men? The conquistadors appeared after Columbus died in 1506, and they were an autonomous military expeditionary force that ventured deep into the Americas to conquer and spread Christianity. One of the first Spanish conquistadors was Diego Velázquez, who launched an expedition to settle Cuba in 1511. The local Taino people resisted, and the chief Hatui even managed to kill 8 different Spanish soldiers and waged a guerrilla campaign against the colonists for the rest of 1511 until he was captured in 1512 and burned alive at the stake. A priest who offered him the last rites was refused because Hatui was so bitter and angry at the Spanish that he told them that if heaven was full of Spaniards, he would rather go to hell. 2 years later, in 1514, Velázquez became the governor of Cuba. But 10 years before that, Hernán Cortés had arrived in Hispaniola, and eventually he ended up helping Velázquez capture Cuba. But tension grew between the two because Cortés was involved romantically with Velázquez's sister-in-law, but didn't commit to her, and Velázquez eventually forced Cortés to marry her. This wasn't the end of the quarrels between the two, though, because Cortés also showed himself to be very charismatic. He was a natural leader and was also very popular, unlike Velázquez, and he started to overshadow him. And Velázquez started to envy Cortés and view him as a threat to his power. In 1517, another conquistador named Francisco Hernández de Córdoba launched a failed mission to the Yucatan Peninsula, which was sanctioned by Velázquez. But the expedition failed because the local mines attacked, and they killed 25 Spaniards, including Cordoba himself. In 1518, Velázquez decided to allow Cortés to launch his own expedition to Yucatan because Velázquez had a nephew named Juan de Grijalva, who established a settlement in Mexico and needed help. So Cortés, of course, wanted to do this, but at the last minute, Velázquez decided to retract his permission for Cortés to do this because he realized he didn't trust Cortés. He already didn't like him, but he also didn't trust him, so he tried to stop him from going. But Cortés, being Cortés, managed to effectively crowdfund a bunch of men and ships to go anyway, and this only succeeded in making Velázquez like him even less. So by 1519, Cortés had proven himself to be an effective military leader, and he defeated the local indigenous people on the coast, and even met his future mistress, La Malinche, who was a mine woman who became his translator and ally to the expedition, and is also very, very controversial because of this. It's also in the same year that Cortés moved north into Veracruz, and from there he began gathering allies among local Mesoamericans like the Tlaxcalans, the Totonac, and the Otomi, because all 3 of those groups were antagonistic towards the Aztecs, who raided and sacrificed them, and this motivated them to work with Cortés against the Aztec Empire, which Cortés hoped to capture for Spain itself. Ironically, the Aztecs who did meet with Cortés weren't hostile towards him at all, as opposed to Cortés' own native allies who originally attacked him and his men before being beaten back and realizing that he could not be easily defeated. And he didn't even seem very hostile towards them, but he was planning on attacking the Aztecs. So Cortés took the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II prisoner, and the Spanish occupied the city of Tenochtitlan after Moctezuma invited them in, not realizing that they were there to take over. As this was happening, a party mobilized by Velázquez from Cuba was sent in to arrest Cortés for his unsanctioned expedition and war against the Aztecs. And this was led by a man named Panfilo de Narvaez, sent in to arrest Cortés. Cortez left the city to deal with them, and by dealing with them, he ended up getting Narvaez's men sent to arrest him to desert and side with Cortez instead because he promised them their own share of the treasure from Tenochtitlan, which seems to be a real running theme with Cortez. But while Cortez was gone, his men massacred a group of Aztec priests, and when he returned, they had a new leader named Cuitlahuac, and Moctezuma himself was viewed as no longer an effective leader and was killed with a shower of darts and rocks thrown by an angry crowd. Cuitlahuac then gave orders for the Spanish to be attacked, and this forced them to retreat, but many of them also tried to bring with them treasure that they had looted from the city, and that led to them drowning in the lake and in the waterways around the city, which earned this event the name La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night. But if you ask people in Mexico today, it's called the Victorious Night. Cortez managed to escape, and in 1521 he returned and recaptured the city, officially bringing an end to the Aztec Empire. The other big name among the conquistadors is Francisco Pizarro. He traveled with Alonso de Ojeda in 1509 to a failed colony known as Uraba in what's now Colombia, and he also accompanied Vasco Núñez de Balboa to the Isthmus of Panama, and they even ended up crossing over to the Pacific in 1513. But he also ended up arresting and even beheading Balboa on the orders of Governor Pedro Arias Davila, who distrusted Balboa in 1519. Pizarro would then go on to conquer the Incan Empire over a decade later in 1532 with the help of fellow conquistador Diego de Almagro. The two reached Cajamarca in Peru as a civil war was tearing apart the Incan Empire, and they exploited said conflict to capture the Incan Emperor Atahualpa. The full conquest of the Incan Empire took longer than that of the Aztecs because the Incan Empire was the largest state within the Americas at that time, and the final Incan holdouts were only defeated in 1572 in the small Neo-Incan state of Vilcabamba. Despite paying out huge amounts of gold and silver to his captors as part of the ransom, Atahualpa was executed anyway by the Spanish in 1533, instigated by Almagro and his supporters. And a few years later, in 1535, Almagro went south to explore Chile, but he didn't find very many riches, and he began to clash with Pizarro over control of Peru, leading to a intra-conquistador civil war that lasted until 1537, with Pizarro and his loyalists winning the struggle, and Almagro being arrested and executed in 1538, though in 1541, some of Almagro's friends decided to take revenge and ended up being able to kill Pizarro. So in a way, the story of Pizarro and Almagro and Balboa was something of a Game of Thrones story, or kind of an anime story, with former friends eventually turning into enemies. There were a few other well-known conquistadors, from Francisco Vasquez de Coronado in the early 1540s. He explored what would become the western United States in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and even Kansas. Pedro Alvarado was actually a former lieutenant of Hernan Cortez, and he conquered south from Mexico into Guatemala and El Salvador a few years after the conquest of the Aztecs. Sebastian de Belalcázar conquered Ecuador and the southern regions of Colombia in the 1530s. Hernando de Soto explored Mississippi in the 1540s around the same time as Francisco Coronado, but he also ended up dying from a fever. And finally, there was the last conquistador, Juan de Oñate, in the 1590s, who settled Santa Fe in New Mexico, but also gained a reputation for extreme cruelty and violence after he massacred the Acoma people in 1599, and he had 1,000 civilians killed, and the survivors, any man over the age of 25, had his right foot cut off and then was sold into slavery. Because of this, Oñate was actually put on trial and then expelled from New Mexico permanently for excessive violence and cruelty, and he wasn't allowed to leave Spain after that. In Brazil, the Portuguese had a counterpart to the conquistadors known as bandeirantes, mixed-race frontiersmen of both Portuguese and indigenous descent based out of the port city of Sao Paulo in southeastern Brazil. These Portuguese counterparts to the conquistadors expanded much more slowly than the Spanish did, which is why the bandeirantes continued into the 1700s, while the last conquistador, Juan de Oñate, was recalled from the Americas and died in Spain in the early 1600s. The bandeirantes also did not come across any large indigenous empires the way the Spanish had, and for that reason there isn't a major analog to Hernan Cortez or Francisco Pizarro among the Portuguese military explorers, but there are a few who do stand out among them. Among the first Portuguese explorers and colonizers were nobles or fidalgos from Portugal who had been granted land by the Portuguese crown, such as Martim Afonso de Souza, who established São Vicente in 1532 after kicking the French out from the area. Tome de Souza, no relation to Martim, was the first of the governor-generals and appointed by King Jean III, who established Bahia in Salvador as the capital of the colony. He also brought in many Jesuits, artisans, and settlers and soldiers, starting up Brazil's sugar plantation economy in the late 1540s. Mem de Sá was the founder of Rio de Janeiro in 1556, and he also kicked out more French colonists and expanded the coastal defenses along with the slave plantation system. Among the major bandeirantes who were especially prominent in the 1600s was Antonio Raposo Tavares, who conquered what is now southern Brazil in the states of Paraná and Santa Catarina in the 1620s and 1630s, and became known for his destruction of Jesuit villages because the bandeirantes were major slave raiders of indigenous people, despite often being part indigenous themselves, and they were often at odds with the Jesuit priests who advocated heavily for the rights of indigenous people. Domingo Jorge Velho was also a famous bandeirante, and his major achievement was the exploration of the northeastern part of Brazil, but he was also known for the ruthless destruction of the Quilombo dos Palmares in 1694. The Quilombos were strongholds of escaped slaves and pretty much anyone sympathetic to them, which included indigenous tribes or even Portuguese fugitives like AWOL soldiers who had decided to leave because they didn't want to serve anymore. And they would often form their own societies in the remote parts of the Brazilian interior, and it would be very difficult to get to them. And they often needed help from bandeirantes like Velho, who could take them out. Bartolomeu Bueno de Silva, also known as Anhanguera, or the Old Devil in the Tupi language, went on an expedition in the 1720s and discovered gold in Rio Vermelho in the central interior of Brazil, which also turned into the state of Goiás. But by the mid-1700s, the age of the bandeirantes had also come to an end. Going back a few centuries, what types of societies were formed after the Iberian kingdoms created colonies in the Americas? Every European power in the Americas during the early modern era engaged in some form of aggression or exploitation of the indigenous or black population, but in different ways. The French are often credited with the best relations with Native Americans up in Canada because they were largely there to trade furs, and they weren't interested in just conquering all the land or just taking over and turning them all into serfs. But they did occasionally wage wars against them, and they were also some of the biggest slave plantation owners in the Caribbean. The English were much more notorious for just expelling indigenous people off their land and then settling it. And it's only later they tried to limit these wars because the wars in the interior were expensive and costly, and the British government itself actually wanted to restrict how far settlers could go in order to avoid unnecessary conflicts that would end up costing them too much. Portugal expanded and committed many atrocities against the indigenous Brazilians, though their main focus was exporting Brazil wood back to Europe and setting up large sugar plantations owned by slaves from Africa. The Dutch were a very mixed bag of trade, smuggling, and slave plantations, but not large-scale conquest or settlement, and they were also not very interested in dominion over large indigenous societies. In the Spanish case, mass enslavement or mass enslavement of indigenous societies was the norm, as the Spaniards had conquered huge amounts of land with several large urbanized societies, the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayans, and that could generate huge amounts of wealth now that they're under Spanish control. And unlike the other Europeans, they were much more religiously expansionist. They largely conquered not just to get rich or to gain more territory, but also to convert more people to Catholicism. And while the Portuguese also did this, the Spaniards had just gotten out of the Reconquista more recently, and they still had a kind of crusading spirit that made getting more land and getting richer synonymous with expanding Catholicism. And it's also around this point that race becomes a major legal category because the idea that there are different types of people has always been around, but it wasn't until around the 15 or 1600s that it became a physical category with moral and legal weight attached to it. And the Spanish were no exceptions because they put the Spanish elites born in Europe at the top. They're known as peninsulares. And then below them, you have the Spanish-born elites known as criollos, or those born in Spanish America. But you also have low-born Spaniards below them, and then you get the mixed-race mestizos, or people mixed between indigenous and Spanish. And below them, you got the pure-blooded indigenous people, especially the ones who didn't live under Spanish control. And below them, you got mulattoes, or people of like mixed black Spanish ancestry. And at the very bottom, you have black slaves. Another thing to keep in mind is that, well, Columbus and the conquistadors had enslaved many Taino in the Caribbean. The Catholic Church eventually stepped in, and the Crown implemented the Leyes Nuevas, or the new laws in the 1540s, that turned the slave system into the encomienda system, which made it more of a serf system, where indigenous Americans lived on the land. They weren't property, but they didn't own the land, and they had to work permanently as workers or servants on giant estates owned by the Spanish. So while it wasn't slavery per se for the average indigenous Latin American or mestizo, the average person there was not free, and that's also without counting the actual slaves of like Black or Southeast Asian people brought in from the Philippines. And the reason for so much mixing was that the Spanish had a large number of military men that they had brought into the New World, and not very many Spanish women because settling it wasn't their original objective. So they intermarried very heavily with both native people and also with their own black slave population. That led to many, many mixed race people appearing across Latin America. So it was a very different system to the English, who were much more hostile towards mixing, and they had much more hard binary between black and white. And I believe that's because their form of settlement was about bringing in and starting families in the New World because they wanted to create a utopian, pure religious society, especially among the Puritans. And mixing was just not very normalized to the same extent. And also, where it wasn't about creating a pure religious society, there were also indentured servants from Ireland, mostly POWs from the wars between England and Ireland, and they'd been brought in as workers, and occasionally they would ally with black slaves in rebellions, and race became a very useful way to keep them apart because if they could convince the Irish servants that they had a way out of the system and that if they just stayed in line they could eventually get freedom, they would do that and even help them against slave uprisings. Economically, the Spanish were very centralized and very mercantilist in the way that they worked because they would avoid trading, giving gold to any other country. And the different Spanish colonies or viceroyalties or virreinatos inside Spanish America weren't even allowed to trade with each other. The entire system was built around either farming valuable crops and sending them back to Spain so they could be sold to profit Spain, or just sending gold and silver directly back to Spain so they could be used to fund wars in Europe. There were 4 big viceroyalties or virreinatos. Then they were the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which is based out of Mexico, and also included the Philippines and I think most of the Caribbean in 1535. The Viceroyalty of Peru was established in 1542 out of the Andes. The Viceroyalty of New Granada was actually based out of Colombia in 1717. And the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, or Silver River, was based out of Argentina and established in 1776. So probably the biggest difference between the Spanish and Portuguese or in the English, French, or Dutch is that the 2 Iberians got to the American continent first, and they're able to take over the parts that were the easiest to profit from at that point in time in the early modern era. Places with large indigenous populations that were could be used for labor, as well as the warm climates, making it very easy to grow cash crops. And there were also huge gold and silver deposits. But the problem is those didn't stay profitable forever because when the English got there to New England, they didn't have any of these advantages, and they had to create a manufacturing economy instead, which in the long run was much more useful and much more profitable. Overall, Latin America's pre-independence era from the 1490s up to the 1800s was an agricultural, extractive economy with heavy control by the Spanish or Portuguese, very little contact between different colonies or viceroyalties, not very many checks and balances, and a built-in divide even among the white Latin American elite. So this was not a system that could last in the long term. So what led up to the Wars of Independence in Latin America? In the 1600s and 1700s, Spain's and Portugal's rule over the New World came to be challenged by the 3 aforementioned powers from Europe, the English, the French, and the Dutch. The Dutch actually invaded Brazil's northern territories in the 1620s to 50s as Portugal and Spain had united into the Iberian Union all the way back in 1580, which meant a war with Spain and Spain's American colonies was also a war with Portugal and all of Portugal's American colonies. They also took over lands the Spanish had claimed in the Treaty of Tordesillas because, while on paper, the Spanish ruled all of the New World outside of the east coast of Brazil, which was claimed by the Portuguese, in reality it wasn't very enforceable, so English and Dutch settlers began making plantations and claiming land in what would later become Guyana and Suriname. The English and French also took territory from the Spanish in the Caribbean, like Jamaica taken from Spain by England in 1655, or the western side of Hispaniola being taken over by the French in the 1620s, and eventually being formalized in the 1697 Treaty of Ryswick, which turned it into Saint-Domingue, later to become Haiti. In the 18th century, there were several major precursors to the event which really led to the breakdown of the Iberian empires in the New World. And the first of those was the American Revolution, fought between 1775 to 1783. It was the first such revolution in the New World that led to a new country being created by former colonial subjects of European empire, which was ironically aided by the Spanish themselves in 1779 because they wanted to weaken British power in the New World, along with the French who actively supported American independence. A related cause of Latin American independence was the spread of the Enlightenment, which championed rationality, self-determination, liberty, democracy, and republicanism. And it was also the reason for why the American Revolution had a coherent vision for independence in the first place. Another big precursor was the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in Peru, also known as the Great Andean Revolt from 1780 to 83, and it led to vast numbers of people of all races and classes fighting and being killed, which was provoked by harsh colonial laws and Spain's Bourbon reforms that increased taxes to benefit Spain itself, and what Tupac himself referred to as abuses by the colonial officials against the will of the Spanish king. Interestingly, he didn't view himself as anti-monarchy. He just believed that the local rulers were just not doing what this king actually wanted. But as the revolt became more radical, it began to call into question the entire colonial system and the ability of the Spanish authorities to contain widespread violent uprisings. Tupac himself was a member of the wealthy indigenous elites, and he was also a nobleman who leveraged his position as an insider within both the Spanish system and the indigenous system as a curaca, or an indigenous chief that actually appeared all the way back in the Incan Empire era, because many of them had sided against the Incans, and as a reward, the Spanish allowed them to keep their position. So because of this, Tupac was able to bridge the gap between indigenous, mestizo, and even the white Criollo elites of Spanish descent born in the New World. And even today, Tupac Amaru II is a major national hero and figure in Peru who stood for overthrowing colonial rule. Brazil also saw a few minor conflicts between Portuguese colonists in the 1700s, such as the War of the Moscates in the 1710s between plantation aristocrats and Portuguese merchants in Pernambuco, which is in the northeast part of Brazil. And there's also the earlier Emboabas War in 1707 because the earlier Paulista settlers from Sao Paulo started to clash with the Emboabas, or later foreign newcomers who had started to arrive, because both were fighting over the gold mines in Minas Gerais in eastern Brazil. And the Emboabas, or hairy legs, because of the way their boots looked, were competing with them over the gold, but the earlier Paulistas just viewed them as just kind of being interlopers. They didn't really deserve the gold because the Paulistas were there first. Though I think the most relevant precursors in Brazil were the Pombaline reforms of the late 1700s. The Pombaline dynasty was ruling in Brazil was similar to that of the Bourbons in Spain. They created reforms which created more hardship for the colonists to benefit Portugal, and this led to the conspiracies within Minas Gerais in 1789 and the Bahia-based Taylor's Revolt in 1798. Both of them were ideologically pro-independence, and they were in favor of a new republic on Portuguese colonial territory, which led to the ringleaders, a part-time dentist known as just the dentist, or Tiradentes in Minas Gerais, and a cabal of Enlightenment-motivated artisans and soldiers in Salvador all being executed. But the main reason for all the wars of independence was the Napoleonic Wars. The wars were started and waged by Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte for a number of reasons relating more to European history. But the important reason is that Napoleon occupied Spain and Portugal itself. And once both the Iberian powers, their home territory was occupied, it became much more difficult for them to control their territories and colonies in the New World. Another unrelated but very impactful cause of the Wars of Independence was the Haitian Revolution, which started in 1791 and ended in 1804 with Haiti becoming the first independent country in the Americas without a white majority, or ruling class for that matter. There's also the unintended effect of British support in Spain's war effort by opening up trade with Spanish colonies, which allowed Latin Americans to profit vastly more than they normally could under the strict Spanish economic controls. And once that was lifted, they didn't want to go back to the original system. And most pressingly, the power vacuum left by the French occupation of Iberia allowed local military juntas to gain power in Latin America, which created a crisis of legitimacy, which further weakened Spanish and Portuguese control in the New World. Now that we've set the scene for why Latin America was so unstable in the decades leading up to independence, how did they finally win independence from the Spanish and Portuguese? The first of the revolutionaries, or libertadores, or liberators, in contrast to the conquerors or conquistadors in Latin American Wars of Independence, not counting Haiti, was a priest named Manuel Hidalgo y Costilla in Mexico, or the then Virreinato de España Nueva. In 1810, he led a popular movement and gave a radical speech known as the Grito de Dolores, or Cry of Dolores, based on the town he was giving the speech in, which condemned the Peninsulares and the Viceroy of New Spain in a town called Hidalgo Dolores before he was captured and executed, which radicalized his followers even more. This set the tone that local monarchies were on the table, but Spain itself had failed them, and that the American-born criollos were distinct from their European-born peninsular counterparts, which allowed powerful local elites to rally other groups like low-born Spaniards, mestizos, indigenous people, or even Afro-Latinos and black slaves to the cause of independence and revolution. It's also in this year independence was declared in Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, and but not widely recognized. Progress was slow because Hidalgo was killed in 1811, and from then into 1816 there were early republics that didn't gain much ground, such as Simón Bolívar's first republic in Venezuela. However, one particular part of the Spanish Empire did break away successfully in 1811, which was Paraguay, largely due to its landlocked remote location and a lack of manpower for Spanish loyalists. In 1814, it was taken over by a very eccentric dictator named José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, who I mentioned in my video on the strangest countries in the world, due to him effectively being a proto-totalitarian leader in the 1810s who closed off Paraguay to the outside world, seized church lands and gave them to indigenous Paraguayans, and made it illegal for white Spaniards to marry other white Spaniards or have any kind of marriage that wasn't interracial. In 1818, José de San Martín, a veteran soldier who actually fought for Spain in North Africa in the 1790s, crossed the Andes and freed Chile, while Bolívar won in Colombia and liberated it from the Viceroy of New Granada in 1819. Mexico then declared independence and acquired recognition by the Treaty of Cordoba under Emperor Agustín de Iturbide in 1821, and San Martín captured the capital city of Lima in Peru. The following year, Martín and Bolívar met in Guayaquil, and Martín effectively stepped down from any kind of political leadership, as the southern cone had largely been liberated, and Bolívar would take over the final liberation of Peru, which came in 1824 at the Battle of Ayacucho. The reason behind this, from what I've read, is that Martín was kind of like the George Washington of Latin America and its independence wars. He was primarily a military leader, not a political leader, and he was very against the idea of military men taking power by force. And because Bolívar was more interested and arguably more qualified to be a leader, he just handed the baton of power over to him instead. Following Ayacucho, Bolivia became independent in 1825, and the Spanish hold on continental or mainland Latin America was effectively over, because the only parts of the Spanish Empire in the Americas from here on out are in the Caribbean, like Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, with the final royalist holdouts on the mainland being taken down in 1833. Brazil's story is much shorter and also much stranger because during Napoleon's occupation of Portugal back in Europe, the royal family fled to Brazil, and the Portuguese king actually liked living in Brazil better than in Portugal, but he still had responsibilities to people back in Portugal because he was the king of Portugal, so he had to leave in 1821. Then in 1822, his son Dom Pedro I proclaimed independence and got it without really fighting because Portugal was severely weakened by Napoleon's invasion, and Pedro actually was the legitimate heir to the throne, so him taking over was more of a dynastic split than a full rejection of the monarchy. So in conclusion, what can we take away from this wild story of exploration, conquest, and rebellion? I think this is one of the most interesting stories in world history because it bridges the gap between the medieval and the modern world, and the fact it isn't known about more widely is very disappointing, especially considering how recent much of it is. Great figures in history, such as Columbus and Hernán Cortés, can simultaneously be the cause of mass suffering and oppression, and also incredible discoveries and developments that still matter even centuries later. The two are not mutually exclusive. Short-term gains can often come with extreme long-term costs because the Spanish and Portuguese grabbed all the shiniest parts of the Americas early in the 1490s and 1500s, while the English and French were stuck with the cold and dull parts. But today, the English and French regions, like in Quebec and Canada and the United States, are the prosperous and stable ones, while the Spanish and Portuguese regions are much more poor and plagued by many more problems. Tyranny and rule by might alone is unsustainable, even with a massive force disparity, such as that between the indigenous people and mestizos and the Spanish crown. Divides among the elites can prove fatal for maintaining power because by diminishing and making the criollos a completely separate, inferior class, the peninsulares and Spanish crown sowed the seeds of resentment, which eventually led to their American-born counterparts leading the pan-racial and class-transcendent struggle against them and eventually winning. The early bird may get the worm, but that doesn't matter if the bird can't keep the worm. Spain and Portugal got to the Americas first before the other European powers, but the English, French, and Dutch showed up later and just took their territory anyway, just the same way that the Native Americans had been there earlier but lost everything in a very short amount of time. And at the very end, once people get rights or benefit from a better system, they don't want to go back to the old system. It's easy to keep poor people poor, and it's easy to keep people from getting rights if they don't already have them. But it's impossible to take away rights and wealth from people who already have it and already know what it's like. Thank you for listening into the World History Addicts podcast. You can follow us on Instagram at World History Addicts podcast. Be sure to follow my friend Dwan's page as well at Entertainment Fanatics Pod. Part 3 of the Latin American History series will be out soon. Until next time, hasta luego.